Chapter 4, Sushi and Sumo. Oh, I love sushi. Basho led Jack and Annie off the Great Bridge and down a crowded road. They passed huge stacks of lumber. Then they came to a row of stages built along the riverbank. On one stage, women were dancing. Their faces were painted white. They wore shimmering kimonos and waved fans. Musicians played on a second stage. They plucked three-stringed instruments and blew on bamboo flutes. Their music was high-pitched and strange, but Jack liked it. On another stage was a puppet show. Puppeteers wearing black clothes moved a giant dragon puppet around the stage. A man stood to the side and told a story to the audience. From the back of the crowd, it was hard to hear him. "What's he saying?" said Annie. "He is telling the legend of the cloud dragon," said Basho. "The cloud dragon is one of the guardian animals of the four directions. She has the power of flight and commands the rain clouds." "Cool," said Annie. Basho led them on past rows of stalls where craftspeople sold beads, cloth, kites, and paper lanterns. Some boys were holding up yo-yos for sale. Jack was surprised to see yo-yos in old Japan. Beyond the craft stalls was a row of inns and cafes. The smell of spices and grilled fish filled the air. "Yum," said Annie. Jack was hungry too. "Would you like to stop at a tea house?" Basho asked them. "Yes," Jack and Annie said together. Basho led them toward a small building with an open front. At the entrance, Basho slipped off his sandals. Jack and Annie did the same. They placed their sandals in a row of shoes that other people had left by the door. Inside the tea house, cooks stirred steaming pots over a wood-burning stove. People sat at the long, low tables, eating with chopsticks and drinking from small cups. Several customers smiled shyly and bowed before Basho. "Basho must be a really famous teacher of the samurai," thought Jack. It made Jack feel important to be with him. Basho led them to a table and sat cross-legged on a straw mat. Jack and Annie did the same. A waiter with a kerchief around his head hurried to the table. "Welcome to our humble tea house, Master Basho," he said. "Thank you," said Basho. "Everyone is so polite in Japan," Jack thought. The waiter handed Jack and Annie and Basho warm, wet towels. "Thank you," said Jack and Annie. Jack watched Basho wipe his hands on the towel. He and Annie did the same. Then they all gave their towels back to the waiter. "I would like plates of sushi for me and my 2 students, please," said Basho. "Thank you," said the waiter, bowing. While they waited for their food, Jack studied the people in the room. Jack noticed that even little kids were eating with chopsticks. He and Annie had never had much luck using chopsticks in Asian restaurants back home. Soon the waiter brought over 3 plates of small cakes of sticky rice wrapped in dark green paper-like strips. He also brought napkins and 3 pairs of chopsticks. When the waiter had gone, Basho spoke to Jack and Annie in a soft voice so no one else could hear. "We call this sushi," he said. "It is rice with pieces of raw fish in the middle." "Raw fish?" said Jack. He gulped. "And what's this part?" Annie pointed at the papery wrapping. "Seaweed," said Basho. "Seaweed?" said Jack. "It is very good," said Basho. Jack was so hungry, he was willing to try anything, even raw fish and seaweed. His only problem was the chopsticks. "Try it this way, Jack," said Annie. She carefully picked up a piece of sushi, between the wooden ends of her chopsticks. Jack copied her. But as they both tried to bring their food to their mouths, their pieces of sushi fell onto the table. Jack and Annie laughed and tried a second time. Annie was successful, but Jack dropped his sushi again. Without thinking, he grabbed it with his fingers and popped it into his mouth. Mmm, said Jack. The vinegar tasting rice, the raw fish, and the green salty seaweed were delicious. But Jack stopped in mid-chew. Two samurai at another table were glaring at him. One of the men had a big scar on his face. The other had fierce, dark eyes. Jack's throat was dry as he swallowed. They saw me mess up with my chopsticks, he thought. They can tell I'm not from Japan. He picked up another piece of sushi with his chopsticks. He glanced again at the samurai. They were watching him like hawks. Jack's hands felt shaky. He tried to stay calm. He remembered a passage from their research book. Samurai did not show their feelings. They had great powers of concentration. Jack tried very hard not to show his fear. He concentrated on holding the sushi with his chopsticks. He raised the sushi to his mouth and ate it calmly. He lowered his chopsticks and picked up another piece of sushi. He ate it calmly. When Jack looked back at the samurai, they were no longer watching him. Jack let out his breath. He picked up his last piece of sushi with his chopsticks and ate it calmly. Very good, said Basho, smiling. Thanks, said Jack. Let us go now, said Basho. Basho folded his napkin neatly and left it beside his plate. Jack and Annie did the same. Basho paid for their meals, and then they stopped at the entranceway to put on their shoes. As they stepped outside, a drum began beating loudly. A huge crowd had gathered on the grassy riverbank. What's happening? Annie asked. Come, I will show you, said Basho. People moved aside so Basho could lead Jack and Annie to the front of the crowd. A large ring had been marked off on the ground with straw. In the middle of the circle, two enormously fat men squatted at opposite sides of the ring. Each man looked as if he weighed more than 400 pounds. They clapped their hands. Then each began stomping his feet. Who are they? Asked Annie, her eyes wide. Sumo wrestlers, said Basho. Sumo wrestling has been our most popular sport for over 1,000 years. The two wrestlers were now perfectly still, crouching down with clenched fists. They were glaring at one another. The whole crowd seemed to hold its breath as the wrestlers stared into each other's eyes. Suddenly, one wrestler lunged forward and grabbed the other. Then the hugely fat men began pushing each other around. They are trying to force each other out of the ring, said Basho. Grunting and groaning, the two men moved backward and forward as spectators cheered wildly. Then one wrestler made a quick move and shoved his rival out of the circle. The crowd roared. Jack found himself cheering too. When the noise died down, Basho turned to Jack and Annie. The first match is over, he said. Shall we go now? Before Jack and Annie could answer him, two samurai stepped in front of them. One had a big scar on his face. The other had fierce, dark eyes. Excuse me, the scar-faced man said. May we see your passports, please? Dun, 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 dun. That's the end of this chapter.